Welcome to another Enspiral podcast. And today we're here with Uli and Nick. I managed to get a hold of the two of you in one space. I'm so happy. It's the first time we're recording a podcast with three people, and we're going to talk about engagement, which is a kind of a broad and important topic to cover in a kind of organization like Enspiral. And maybe let's start with scoping the topic a little bit. So let's start with you, Uli. What is engagement? How would you define that, and why is it important and relevant for us to talk about?
So engagement in general for me is any kind of activity between people. Like zero engagement basically means it's dead, like there's nothing happening. And engagement, I would also differentiate. It's not just one thing, but it's kind of many things. Like on a broad level, there can be in-person engagement, like physical in-person stuff. There can be digital engagement, which can be synchronous or asynchronous, like just a text chat or even a Google document with comments. It's kind of an asynchronous engagement. And there's so many tools, digital tools that we use at Enspiral, like Co-Budget. So this is kind of people being active and doing something, whether it's in person or not, digital or not, remote, synchronous, asynchronous, anything that's like make something happen. Oh. What do you think, Nick? What's engagement for you?
Yeah, the thing I'd add to that is that the active part of that can just be receiving. It can just be receiving information and feeling part of things in that way. So for me, engagement is as you describe it, but there's a purpose to it, and that purpose is retaining that connection or being aware of what's going on, or feeling part of something, or feeling a sense of belonging. And I think that also differs for different people. And sometimes it's kind of easy to have this one size fits all idea of what engagement is or should be or could be based on our own lens. So I'm really conscious of, depending on where people are at, their time, their interests, their just even their mood on the day. Engagement goes up and goes down, and that's all okay. But what does that actually mean then for trying to, I don't want to make this sound like an effort, but maintain the connectivity within a network like Enspiral? Because I think what comes up often is the importance of that connectivity in whatever form it is.
I'm glad that you brought this perspective of the receiving part as engagement as well, that maybe it's not just not necessarily always adding new information, but sometimes you can actually create this feeling of belonging and staying engaged just by receiving information, which somehow might feel like counterintuitive, like, oh, when there's not new messages and comments, maybe there's no life happening. And I guess from here, maybe we can segue quite naturally to this concept of 1990 rule. I remember during one of our conversations, Uli, you totally blew my mind and by bringing this up. So I just can't imagine having a conversation about engagement without talking a little bit about this principle.
Yeah, it's also called 1% rule. If you look it up on Wikipedia, it's actually called the 1% rule. And I have seen it in different numbers, but I think the most common number is, depending on how you read it, it's 1990 or it's 991. And it means like one, if you have any community, whether it's an online community or even like at work, in business, and like in a corporate environment, you have like 1% that's highly active and highly engaged and driving most of what's happening in a community. And then you have 9%, I think they're called contributors. Like an analogy is like the 1% is writing an article, and the 9% are those that do likes and maybe do a little comment, like low effort engagement. And then you have 90% of the lurkers that they don't do anything and you don't even know they're there. But and some are actually maybe not even there anymore. But as Nick said, some of them are actually maybe even reading, and so that's the 1% rule. Yeah, and I'd like to share a little experience I had that had a huge impact on me regarding this principle. My very first contact with Enspiral was in 2019 when I went to a workshop that was held by Enspiral, and that was even before I became a member. And engagement was one of the topics during that weekend. And we did a exercise, and the exercise was, think of a topic in which you are highly engaged, and then place yourself in the room on one corner where you're highly engaged, or in the other corner where you're not engaged. And we did like in 2 steps. First one, think of a topic where you're highly engaged, and then think of a topic you're really with low or no engagement. And I do remember that sense in that room of, depending on where you stand, you think of the other side, why are these guys not doing anything, like when you're on the high engagement side. But when you then flip to an area where you really don't have energy or interest, or for whatever reason you're not engaging, you're thinking of the other guys, why are they like bothering me all the time and like pushing me into engagement? I told them I don't have time to do anything. Like, you have these very opposite like experiences, and that made me really understand and be more compassionate with the other side. And that physical experience in that room, and like that contrast of like stepping from one into the other, that was a magical experience. That had a real impact on me. So what do you think, guys? Anything to add to the 1% rule?
I think it's a really interesting concept, because there's definitely those who you call them the lurkers, the watchers, whatever that biggest part often is. And then there's the casually engaged, and then the intensively engaged. I mean, I think my sense is that 1% is really low for the sort of networks and communities that we're often talking about within Enspiral. And I wonder, if that's a general rule across, all of everything. Definitely the networks I'm part of, I feel it's probably closer to 5%. It's not necessarily 10 or 20 or 30, but it does feel like in these spaces, perhaps where you're purpose driven, there are more people prepared to step in and help carry that engagement flag, if you like, than perhaps there might be elsewhere. So I don't know what others of you have experienced on that side, what you see, what you notice.
Yeah, what's coming up for me is, I guess, the purpose behind the work for sure plays a role. I mean, I can imagine, if people generally step in to this kind of non-profit, especially, but purpose-driven game, then yeah, you're doing it because you care. So I would even risk saying that there might be over-engagement that is not sustainable and can even lead to like more burnout scenario, which would be kind of on the opposite end. But yeah, at least from my experience of being in different networks, the purpose for sure plays a different role. But I would be actually curious to kind of measure it and to really reflect, like, how far can you push this 1%? Like, can you make it 3? Can you make it 5? And what about the 9%? Can I make it 15 or 20? Or this is already like unrealistic number? Because I guess at the end of the day, if there's this amazing network, my expectation would be that everybody contributes, right? Everybody's active, everybody's showing up, but then it's not happening, and that's frustrating. And then what do I do with that? And the other tension to like make it a little bit more complicated, but deliberately to show the complexity, is to turn a little bit back to what we said before. Like, what about these lurkers of the 90% that are actually highly engaged? They just choose not to show it. Yeah, I'm curious how you think about that, Uli.
Yeah, I find that tension really interesting of, and you guys remember, and I think Nick, you also remember, because we had like last year a conversation about, are we bringing in enough people to like some important discussions? Like there was some activities last year started with low engagement, and then those people that engage were always the same guys that engage. And then Nick, you brought up the question, do we actually make enough effort of bringing in like some of the, well, more, well, I'm not sure the right term, like fringe voices or the voices that don't speak up, and to get more complete picture. And I find that a really interesting tension. I say interesting, sometimes it's hugely frustrating, because on one side you have the attitude, which I think is also a valid kind of conclusion from that 1% rule. Work with the people that show up, like those people that are motivated, that are here, engage with them and move something forward. Because quite often, and we often don't even know, but I think quite often a large part of the lurkers have actually would give or did give the mandate to the people that are active, and like trust these folks know what they're doing. I don't have time and energy. I'm happy for them to move it forward. While we then think, oh, we don't know what they think, and we should bring them in. And there's a tension, a huge tension between let the guys or the folks do that are motivated and that are here, let them do the stuff, instead of like putting energy and trying to pull the lurkers into more activity. Yeah, so there's a whole tension, and I also agree the numbers, the 1%, I do think we're a little higher at Enspiral, and there is maybe stuff we can do to make it a little higher, but I think broadly, I think the rule there is it's valid to say it's a smaller portion that's really active, and you can get the contributors to make some contribution with low effort, and the majority you cannot get them on. And these lurkers have valid reasons, like, oh, they have a child, like they don't have time for anything, or they're busy at work, or they're sick, long-term sick, or they have been really active for like 5 or 10 years, and they have to go into a higher orbit to kind of like recuperate some of the energy and motivation to come back. So we don't know what the reasons are for the lurking. So it's a really interesting tension. So Nick, I'll let you kind of riff on that.
Yeah, and I was going to bring up what you've just mentioned is that we don't know what that reason is, and my sense is that it's many varied reasons. Excuse me. And if the reason is I don't have time, I don't have energy, I've done a lot, I need a break, that's all well and good. But if the reason is I don't feel like I have permission, I don't know how to, I don't feel like I've been invited or something, that to me is a different question. And so much of this comes back around to how much energy wants to be put into the system in order to catalyze that engagement. And I recently came across a podcast, and someone was talking about, in a purely digital online community like a Mighty Networks or a Slack type environment, if you've got 200 people, it starts to become self-sustaining. Up until that point, your 1% or 5% or whatever it is too small, and it's not going to keep things alive on its own. And you've got to keep putting energy in and putting energy in. So when you have an Enspiral type network, and it's maybe 200 people connected in total, and there's 2 people involved in renovating the entire way that membership is structured, to me there's some big questions. And it's like, do that other 198 just simply not have time, or is there something else that we're not naming? And the big question is then whose interest, responsibility, energy goes into going and finding out? And is that important? Or, like you say, Uli, is it by the default understanding is that if you don't step in and engage, you're giving permission to those who do, and I think that's actually really valid. So yeah, for me, there's a real gray area there as to, I'd love to see more people engaged, but why? What's in that for me? And for me, it feels like it's about diversity of voice And I think a sense that people are seeing enough value so they'll overcome those barriers. And I'm not expecting 100% or 50%, but when it's down to 1%, I feel something is there that we're not seeing and naming and perhaps addressing.
Yeah, the questions of lurkers, and I like that you bring this. Yeah, just the why question. Why are they choosing to be lurkers? And yeah, maybe it's as simple as lack of time and life circumstances, but maybe and probably some percentage of those lurkers have different reasons that maybe can be worked with or worked through. But then I guess the question that I have, which is maybe more like kind of strategic / tools question, is how to engage with this 90% that is watching or following or not in a way that is compassionate and kind and respectful, and also showing up from the place that I do not know why you're not engaged. Maybe you are actually just reading and that's comfortable place for you, but is there anything that I can do to make it easier for you to step in? Because this seems like a very important posture to have, but I'm curious how that translates to some actions that you can take. And I don't know, Will, if you have some experiences with this kind of protocols or just actions in networks.
Yeah, I think on a very fundamental level, and I do think we're doing quite a lot of things right, is having that open communication and transparency of what's happening, and that requires like active communication. Like we have the newsletter once a month, we email it out, and even those folks that don't come on the different other tools, they still have that email summary of what's happening. So, and I don't know if you know about Working Out Loud from John Stepper. Have you heard of it? Nick, ever heard of it? Because that's kind of like, he kind of made a whole method of it and even brought it into the corporate world, because I got in touch with Working Out Loud at work. Like, so that's how I heard of it. And with the principle of make what you're doing visible and just be open and share what you're doing without really knowing who's reading it, what will come out of it. Like you don't have a specific, like you don't have a specific purpose in mind, or you're focusing on a specific outcome. You're just sharing. And then someone will read it, someone might respond to it, someone might contribute to a question that you just voiced that was in your head, and you just wrote it down and you share it. And I do think we're doing this. Maybe we could do it a little better. I do think fundamentally, and this is maybe something we can talk about later when we talk about tools, we're a little messy. Like we have Slack, but after 3 months, all the messages are gone. Like that's gone forever. And the Google Docs we use a lot. If you don't have the link, you will never find anything that you're looking for. Or Lumio, it's also like, if you don't know the specific conversation you're looking for, you will never find it again, because it has moved down, way down. And we do have the handbook. That's a really valuable resource, but it hasn't been updated in a long time. It hasn't been actively used. And so I feel like we could do a better job to make it easier to find things. And I think having that transparency of being able to look at it like on demand, like every person can decide by himself, or like, I want to know more, so I can get more. And there's like a cliff that, or a gap that we don't handle very well. But I do think we handle, like with the newsletter, we handle it well. This kind of one thought that came up on like how to be more inviting, or like make a effort to open up that invitation to anyone to take it. I also want to bring out one other thing, which quite interestingly, like when that activity last year happened, Nick, I don't know if you remember it like this, but I do remember you just making, you came into the chat and you expressed interest, and then like 1 or 2 months later, you left the chat. Like there was no comment whatsoever. Like, oh, Nick left. He was so excited about this. Why did he leave? And I reached out to you, and this is now the second point I'm making. Like, and again, this comes to like the Enspiral principle of connection, being connected, and having a foundation of trust, and like people first. I just reached out to Nick, and a huge conversation came out of it, and I totally understood like why he disengaged and what's going on. And for me, that cleared up that gray area of I don't know why someone is not engaging. And I think there is a lot of good stuff that came out of me engaging with you disengaging. But that had to happen on a one-on-one basis. And you and I had a foundation from some previous activity, so I felt like able to just reach out to Nick, because I've had engagement with Nick previously, and there was some trust already there. Nick.
And I think that trust, as you say that, you know, it starts to play in my mind is what role does that play? And I think perhaps it plays a bigger role than we think it does. You know, I know that when I started in Enspiral, receiving emails as like an onboarding series of 6 emails that said, your opinion in Slack, I'm paraphrasing, is as important as anyone else's. Just step in and engage, was the permission I needed to think, oh, my opinions are valued here. I'm going to message something, you know. The fact that some of those messages then went like out into like silence was the bit that then was like, oh, hang on a minute, what am I saying? But I think there's some real building of trust, losing of trust, undermining of trust. There's a lot, I think, in that goes on, and I really like what you pointed to there earlier, which is like, it's almost like a one-on-one, and if it doesn't have to be, what tends to happen is it's one person who's doing all of that work, whereas if it was more of a group responsibility, and again, this comes down to how many people are engaged, you know, someone spots someone leaving 2 or 3 channels in Slack and just not posting for ages. Is there somebody who knows them, who's there, who goes, hey, I'm just going to go and check in with so-and-so and see how they're doing and see if there's anything there that we can learn from? And it's not a, hey, why have you left? Come back. It's much more of a, I'm really curious. And it feels like we have the openness to have those conversations. And I do wonder how much, you know, again, trust plays a part in being able to have that conversation. Because like I say, you and I had some pretty good conversations prior to that. So the table was already open, and I knew that I could say whatever I was thinking and feeling, and you would be open to hearing me, and we could actually unpack it from there. And that doesn't exist everywhere, even within Enspiral.
Wow, this feels very, very powerful. What you brought. Thank you for sharing this. And you know, it just kind of perfectly links to the invisible engagement, right? And the role of it, because essentially that's where the magic happened, and this layer of trust that was already cultivated suddenly started to, wow, like sprout properly. So yeah, I'm curious about that, because you know, maybe it's easy from a point, you know, like come from this kind of network manager hat, and you know, I want my KPIs and I want percentages of people engaging and going down a certain path that I wish, you know, our members to follow. But what about the invisible part, and like how we can still measure the health of the ecosystem, knowing that a lot of that will not be visible to us, or at least we won't have an easy way to do that, and having, you know, also a decentralized organism when there's not necessarily like one role that you're the person responsible to make sure that everyone who can contribute contributes, but it's kind of everyone's responsibility to hold at least this layer of trust. So yeah, I'm really curious to go a bit deeper into the invisible side of engagement.
Yeah, and I think one of the key things there is you talk about measurable, and one of our great dangers is, because it's measurable, we measure it and then we use it as a metric and we give weight to it. so often if we're not careful, we're talking about numbers of people engaged, the amount of time they spend engaged, how many responses, how many posts, how many people turned up at the code budget round. And the example that came to mind as you were talking is, and it's like, if a person within a network reaches a point where they really need to connect with others, and they do it once, maybe in 4 years, but that provides them with the support and the help they need in that moment, how do you measure that?
Yeah. Yeah, that's really hard to measure. And for me, I think one of the key moments also for me at Enspiral is I was repeatedly voicing my frustration to some really senior, like very experienced Enspiral folks, like 10 years. And I kept being frustrated, like there's nothing happening here. Like this is what's going on. I was expecting so much activity. It's nothing is happening. And they started telling me about stuff that's happening that I've never heard about what's going on. And there is a huge layer, and I love numbers, but I'm just making up the numbers. But I do think the amount of engagement that's invisible, I think it's more than 50%. I think less than 50% is visible. And I'm now really making up the numbers. Like what's visible is like what's happening on Slack, like what's visible in digital spaces and maybe on a photo of a gathering, like that's visible, but like one-on-one conversations, like Nick, you and I, we had like a period where we had regular calls for hours that were hugely motivating and engaging and gave us so much value. And for that time, that was for me the highest value I got out of Enspiral, like having these conversations. And no one in Enspiral knows about it until now, that we had these conversations. And I do hope there's more like this. And there's also on a business level, and maybe Michał knows about that, there's like conversations that kind of where like it's more with a focus on business and maybe even on your own business. So like it's not that community and spiral focus, but it's like the focus, what can someone help me with my business? And that's like a value, like I do think there is so much more, like the one-on-one conversation, there's a business layer, there could be even friendship layers. I think there is, which some of the old folks say, it's kind of a network of friends. And so real friendship. And by the way, Nick and you, Michał, you had a really interesting conversation about friendship in your previous talk about Nick's newcomer guide. And so friendship is working groups, and often the working groups, until they produce an output, you don't see anything. Like you could say no one is doing anything at Enspiral, and then 3 months later, there is a huge report with 150 pages coming out, and like 5 people have been working day and night to produce this, and you don't even see it. So this is it's kind of crazy, like the invisibility of engagement. And you look at one metric of like how many people have responded to my post on Slack, no one. The engagement is dead or 0, but you're only looking at like one little metric. And I do think it's kind of almost maybe like the iceberg, that only a really small fraction is visible. I'm kind of convinced it's more than 50% that's invisible of value. Like you said, Nick, like someone getting out of like just one deep conversation, getting out so much that they stay with Enspire for 2 years without needing anything else. It's unmeasurable and it's completely invisible to everyone else. And I also want to add, and then I'll give it back to you. I also think it's kind of a missed opportunity of making it visible, because it can also be inspiring of like as for newcomers that have no idea what's going on, how people work here, and having some transparency or historical records can be so inspiring. And you can also see like people of contact to talk to about something specific. So having that paper trail of some past experience or making more visible shows newcomers also what's possible. Like I find that a real missed opportunity of not making more visible of what's invisible. Oh.
I I remember, my early experience of Enspiral and coming into Slack, after having been to an event and saying, where is everybody? That was my experience. And what dawned on me was, like you say, there are these sub networks and connections that are always firing at different levels away, but it's not visible. And I know I've seen various attempts to try and almost raise the visibility of that by having either sort of monthly Zoom calls, or get-togethers, or things that happen that pull people together to share about things. I think the newsletter does an awesome job at that. It's just a one piece of, this is a window into what's happening in the network, and I learned so much that I don't know about from that. And it's the one thing I'll look through and go, oh, okay, I might not be interested in most of this, but it's really cool to see how much is actually happening. And it may even be someone in the network who's just doing something outside the network. But to me, that's still engagement in the broader purpose of people doing good stuff, So I would love to see more visibility. I don't know how much of that I would consume. Again, it comes back to time and energy. And I don't know how much energy it would take to do it and what format it is. But it feels like a really interesting place to explore, but also perhaps look back and speak to people and say, hey, what's been explored so far to try and do this? Because I'm sure it's been tried. And what worked, what didn't, what lessons are there to learn? It feels like a space of still continual experimentation. And I don't feel that perhaps we have the energy or inspiration or motivation to experiment as much as we could to be evolving what engagement means. Let's just say not better or worse, but just evolving what engagement means for Enspiral.
Yeah, the newsletter, I think it plays for sure an important role, but it's kind of also funny to mention that, I'm compiling the newsletter, and I precisely did this because I felt like, okay, I want to know what's happening in the network. So I'm going to take this role, and this way I'm going to kind of know. But the thing is that I still don't feel like I see the invisible things. So even I see the Slack posts, they point at Lumio to the useful things, and sometimes I reach out to someone to ask a specific question, or I get asked, or something is shared with me. But there's still like this invisible side that I'm not really seeing because it's invisible. So yeah, it's interesting just to mention that yeah, there is a window into the network, and it points what is already kind of visible if you just look a little bit closer. But it doesn't really necessarily point on what is the invisible, like really invisible stuff. And I feel like we can see the tremendous value of that. And I also resonate with what you were saying, Uli, that yeah, there for sure is something very encouraging about showing examples and almost kind of like just inspiring people to do the invisible engagement, or showing them how, because maybe it's less exposing, maybe it's less vulnerable to, rather than post on Slack or Lumio, to reach out to this person that you met at the gathering, or you've been in a pod, or you connected in another way, or just reach out to a stranger, an account on Slack that just posted something interesting, and it's precisely down the track of your interest. I mean, I feel that myself, every time I hit send on the newsletter, I'm terrified because like, oh wow, I'm just gonna send this thing. It's like, no, what if I missed, some important thing, or I'm saying something wrong? It's like, shit. So it is, I can see that it's terrifying, or it might feel terrifying to like even post on a water cooler. And I'll add one point here. Something that I reflected on it today, because just today we moved to a new platform for our newsletter, and this kind of was an invitation for me to just do slightly more experimentation. And also, you know, just naturally, I reflected more and more on the newsletter itself. And one thing that was coming up for me for quite a while is that, you know, we have this whole section that is dedicated to promoting what people do, but there's actually not so many people putting information there. So it's kind of the usual, right? The 9% plus the 1% that shares, oh, I'm doing this, I'm doing that, I'm doing that. An occasional other person kind of drops something. But it's I don't know what's the percentage, but it's quite low. And sometimes there's just not so many things to share. Like, hey, 3 things, you know, 3 bullet points. But I'm sure there is so much more. So I'm curious. Yeah, it just maintains invisibility. This time I tried to make an explicit invitation in the newsletter just as a tactic. And I was like, hey, this section is for you. Reach out to me. Let's see if something happens for the next edition.
Yeah, I think having these calls to action really explicit, that helps, because sometimes it's really not clear. And as we also had like talked about some other time, not everyone has the same context. Not everyone is on the same page, and like bringing people, having however way we do it, but trying to help everyone onto the same page is quite challenging and needs some extra effort. And so I think calling out these call for actions is really useful. And I also wanted to add, because we changed from was it MailChimp, Michał? This MailChimp, that horrible tool. We changed it to Substack, which I really like in general. And actually, that just when you mentioned it, Substack will now allow comments. So which we never had. Like newsletter was a one-way street, fire and forget, and no one could, even if they wanted to, respond to a newsletter so far. And now we have comments. So there's a new area of engagement possible. So that's something maybe to keep specifically an eye on. I also wanted to add to the invisibility, because if someone is getting value or engaging in some, let's say, below the surface, it's not visible to everyone else. There is one person at least, usually it's more, but it maybe minimum is kind of 2, but there is 1 or 2 people in network that know about it and no one else knows about it. And I think there is where the connectivity and the trust maybe plays a role. I don't think you can have tools perfected to a way that you get 100% of like visibility on everything. It's kind of impossible. But you can make opportunities for people to share, and some people are more connected to other people. And so I think that human factor plays a role, and having gatherings, that's maybe also why gatherings are such a central like instrument where people come together, and usually there's an explosion of energy that kind of spills out to like the weeks or month after the gatherings, well, or should be. But I also think it can be made a more explicit practice to say, share what you're doing, share what you need, and it can be made a little more explicit. Because if you, and I think this is a general maybe issue or question, how we're doing onboarding, and we all know that some of us had great experience onboarding, and I know that many did not have great experience. And we did a survey, I think 2 years ago, and it came out 50% had horrible experience and 50% had a good experience. Like, this is not a great statistic. And I do think we could do more with some explicit practices and helping newcomers, and also reminding old folks of like, this really works. Like sharing is caring and can come back and bring value to you and to others.
And I like you mentioned the role that gatherings play. You know, even if we're broadly talking about digital engagement, often it's that in-person burst of activity and connectivity that spills over. I think what sits there for me is the value in, rather than that burst going from okay, we're ticking along at what feels like 1% engagement, and suddenly it goes to this burst of 100. How do we stop it dropping back to 5 over a period of 6 weeks? How do we keep it at even 40? And that to me is where I feel the tools, and this might be a good segue into talking about tools, is, you know, the tools and the platforms and the way we engage digitally, it's lacking. You know, it doesn't serve us, because I think if it did serve us, we would see higher levels of engagement and higher levels of sharing. But there's always barriers. There's always, you know, I've seen the same message go into 4 different Slack channels and email. And it's like, well, you know, the system's not working when that's the only way someone can try and get to reach everybody with a message. And it was an important message about an upcoming something like Summerfest, you know. And those were 4 of the Slack channels I follow, and I don't follow them all. So how many actually went into, I don't know. So I think there's some really interesting stuff of, so, you know, what can we leverage to actually try and retain more of that connectivity? And if we see only, say, you know, of that burst of activity, if only 5% is visible, actually, is there a 20% that remains invisible that's there? I actually don't think there is, because I think a lot of that was there before the event. So, you know, you come to an event, you make lots of connections, and then people seems to me that you tend to drift back to your existing networks. And unless you make a conscious effort to connect and then sort of build a relationship like you and I did early, which was purely digital. I've never met you in person. And that comes down to the individual need, desire, energy, motivation, feeling comfortable and safe to do so. So yes, I'm really interested in thoughts and around tools and things, because, you know, I'm also involved in a couple of other networks, and I see similar patterns playing out, where a cohort will come together for a course and there's a burst of activity, and then I see it just drops away. You know, in one space, you know, I'm trying. My role is to curate a space for regenerative farmers in New Zealand to come together to support each other. And we're having to put a lot of energy in to try and get people there and get them sharing. And when they share, huge value. But, you know, there are things in the way just from the platform itself we happen to be using. And I think those tools, they can play a role, but they can also get in the way. And I'm curious from both of you what your experiences have been on that. And maybe that's a good segue into that part of the conversation.
Yeah, I'd like to mention also because that's also a good place, the different types of engagement. Like there's an in-person event, there's a synchronous event like a Zoom call, and then there's asynchronous stuff with chat or Google Documents or something else. I think these things, they can like transform from one into the other. Like we're having now a remote digital but a synchronous call. There will be a recording, someone will watch it, then it has become asynchronous. Like it was synchronous, but it has become asynchronous. And then if we make a little summary in the comments of YouTube of this gathering, then someone that doesn't have time to read or like listen to hours of conversation, he can spend 2 minutes, read it, still get something out of it, and decide if he wants to invest in watching it or not. What I'm like want to indicate, the different kinds of engagements that can be transformed, and maybe they also have to be transformed. There's also a level or like an aspect of aggregation or like abstraction. And Michał, you introduced me to Second Brain, where it's a fundamental principle of like you have like for a lot of nodes, but then you need a summary of the nodes, because otherwise you cannot manage the amount of information, and there can be a whole hierarchy of some summarizations. And I do think that's just an important part of it. And I think like my second point is, it's a missed opportunity to have an engagement and don't record anything. Like there's no picture, there's no minutes, there's no video or voice recording, there's nothing. Like I find this a real missed opportunity, and I really like when there's a gathering and there's some documentation, some recording, because that kind of keeps something alive and allows it to be used for something else, and makes it available also to the rest. because you said, Nick, you said 100% engagement at a gathering, but realistically, it's actually maybe only 20% or maybe 30% because not everyone is coming to every gathering. So you already have like excluded 70% of the community from your gathering if you don't share anything afterwards. So I find that also a missed opportunity, but it is effort that you have to put in. And I did put in like a huge effort into one of the gatherings I participated, and there is like a huge document structured. There's at a gathering, I made an effort of taking pictures of like stuff that's happening, of people, but also like if we draw a picture somewhere, I made sure that I took a picture of it to have it digitally to share it with everyone else. So I do think it's an effort someone has to be willing or also interested in doing, and it's a missed opportunity if you don't do it. And third point is, I think the in-person space and the digital space are so different. And that's something I think, Nick, you also hinted at, like, or I don't know, Michał, about the sense of place. And I think it's so different. And I think there's a real challenge of like translating that energy or bringing it into a different space. I think there's a huge challenge. I remember like that workshop in 2019, that those 4 days were so intense. When I was in the train to the airport, I fell into a depression like instantaneously because that connection that was so intense for 4 days was cut off. And I remember standing in the train, it was full, I couldn't sit, I had to stand in the train for hours. And I felt so depressed, like so miserable because that connection was lost. And the digital space, I don't think, to be honest, it's capable these days to give the same. But I do think it can do different things and it has different strength. Like if you engage digitally, you almost always have automatically a recording of it. But it's like a whiteboard you draw, or this Zoom call that you record, you have automatically a full recording of what's happening. So I do think digital is different, but it has new opportunities and they should be used to the maximum. No.
I like that idea that sort of almost encouraging people to create an artifact of a point of connection. And it may not always be appropriate, but I suspect there's value in 50% of what happens that's currently invisible. And again, it comes back to trust. As are you happy for that artifact to be shared? But it's that's a really nice idea, and I definitely relate to that the difference between in person. And I was been having some conversations with Mark Kroning in Enspiral about living systems design, and I really exploring this idea of what makes a digital network, particularly in something like a multi-networks type space, become self-perpetuating and self-fulfilling and self-alive. And his question was kind of like, show me a living system that isn't rooted in place or isn't grounded in place. And that's where, for me, it was like, actually, this idea of just focusing on the digital umbrella and that'll be enough. I think it's something Enspiral has known for a long time in terms of the cadence of the gatherings. But to me, it spoke to something more regular that was grounded in space. And how does that work? So with this group, community of farmers, it's kind of like, okay, so what happens at a regional level on a more regular basis? There's stuff already happening, but how do we connect that to this digital umbrella such that it's not feeding it, isn't the right word, but it's supporting it. One is supporting the other mutually, as opposed to you do this thing in place and we do this thing digitally, and the two are disconnected. And that's an area I'm really interested in exploring, because to me it feels like there's life and energy there. And then the digital bit doesn't become something you've got to then, had an awesome conversation with someone in the network. Now I've got to go and create something and post it into Slack to share my artifact. What's the version where that becomes something I'm energized to do because it's easy and it's just part of what happens, as opposed to, I've got to remember to tick this box and do my job as a good network member.
I love you bringing this perspective. But you know what? I will share from my experience. I think this is something that traditional Dream Factory is very good at. Is whenever I see people taking pictures of themselves like meeting, and interestingly, this is like a space-based network, right? There's like a home base that is a location, but especially when I see people connecting outside of there, because it's kind of, I guess, obvious that they will connect there. And, you know, it's nice to see pictures of what is happening, who's there, all that kind of stuff. But seeing just like a selfie of 2, 3, 4, 5 people meeting somewhere, it just makes me so happy, even if I'm not there and maybe I don't even know people or not all of them. It's like, ah, nice. It's really cool. Like I'm glad some kind of connection happened. So I really like this artifact idea and like proof of connection, you know, to kind of Web3 language funkify this. But yeah, I also see your point, Nick, that oh yeah, if it's just another thing like I have to, if I have a call with someone, then I have to take a picture of the call and post it on Slack. Maybe it feels like a hassle. Maybe it doesn't. But I would be curious to experiment with, yeah, like even do a thought experiment or like actually practice this. Like, what could be this cultural artifact that comes from a place of fun and joy and effortlessness, and for that harvest or harness the power of technology, right? We have these amazing tools that do lots of things just automated. We don't need to do so much. That could actually just reinforce this feeling or like, oh no, there is things happening. You know, the people just met and they talk about this and I don't need to know anything else. It's just nice to see that it's happening. Yeah, that's what's coming up for me.
And I think that there are tools that help, you know, not just the, you know, there are some of those platforms will just send a summary. I get some, or I get a weekly summary, you know, and I virtually never go to the platform at all itself, but I see that there are 132 new posts and here are 3 topics, and I have some sense of connection to it, even though I never go there. And of course, you know, now with AI growing in its capabilities, the ability to you know, say, oh, I've got a bunch of notes, I'm just going to shove that into something like ChatGPT and just see what the summary comes out at, and maybe I post that. You know, there are potentially ways to make that quite seamless nowadays. I'm curious to see what opportunities that opens up as we go forwards.
Yeah, I also want to add, I think different people have different preferences, and there's folks that really like synchronous stuff, and there's folks that really like asynchronous stuff. There might also be like different introvert, extrovert characteristics playing a role in, I can more freely express myself in writing than standing in front of people. And there's also folks like me. I like documentation. I like writing. I like precision in words, and I actually enjoy writing that stuff and making those notes and being like attentive to details and taking these pictures and thinking about it while everyone's having fun. I think about preserving the moment to share it with the 70% that's not here today, but I'm enjoying it. And I do remember I tried to help someone else from a gathering that I was not participating in to do that documentation, and it was impossible. Like, it was, that person wanted to help but had zero in interest or aspiration of whatsoever to do the documentation, and it completely failed. Like, nothing came out of it. Like, what I'm saying is, you can't expect everyone to do that. But if you have, and this comes maybe back to the critical mass of people and also critical mass of skills, if you have a group and you have the skills, the different skills, because I'm not a person that would be facilitating a open session in front of 20 people. That's something I would never do. But I'm the guy that makes notes of that session that's valuable to 70% of the community that wasn't part of it. So I just want to emphasize that perfection, everyone's doing the same thing, I don't think is possible, but this is kind of the beautiful, using the collective to utilize the collective. That's the point I want to make. No.
Michał?
I just wanted to reflect that, yeah, I like this. You know, my brain immediately goes like, how can this be an engaging, playful game? You know, and already where my thoughts went is like, okay, so what if, you know, it's like some kind of challenge where you just create something from a meeting, and it doesn't even need to be something that you share if you don't feel like. You know, it can be a drawing in your journal, it can be one sentence, it can be a note, it can be a picture, a screenshot, whatever, and start there. And maybe some people start sharing, and then it becomes an interesting way to keep the ball going. But I totally see you, Uli. And you know, just to add to that, I always find it such a blessing that there are people who love taking notes and just can't help but take great notes. It's like the one of the biggest assets for any team that is doing something together is the note taker. As the facilitator, the catalyst, and all the different archetypes, like it's all needed. And when there is diversity, it's the most thriving ecosystem.
Yeah, and I'm really struck by when you were describing, Michał, you know, just a simple photo, a selfie of 2 people or 3 people meeting up, how powerful that is to know that connection is happening. And you're right, you know, I mean, I felt the sense of that as you described it, and go, yeah, just all this stuff that I think is like, where is everyone? Even if it was just a, hey, and I met up with so-and-so, or hey, I jumped on a call with so-and-so, or hey, you know, that actually has real value to know that those connections are there. And it almost also gives permission for me, you know, or particularly somebody new to the network, to say, oh, yeah, there's these one-on-ones and small group meetings happening. Maybe that's my form of engagement, is that's where I'm comfortable, and I'll reach out to people who I think might be interested in having a conversation with. So, you know, the power of a simple photo of people meeting, I think that's really exciting.
Yeah, and as newcomer, you have to know these are all the areas of possible engagement, and that this is all the things that are happening. If you come to Enspiral, you don't know any of that. You can't even guess it, and that's kind of, I think, a missed opportunity of expecting, oh, you have to work it all out yourself, whatever works for you. Like that's what you guys also talked about in the last conversation about your newcomer guide of, like, how do you put it, like swim or sink mentality. And I also don't quite agree with that, because we could really just show them, like, these are the options.
This sounds to me like a great guide to add to the handbook, Uli. Just a list, bullet points. Hey, would you like to be more engaged in Enspiral? You can do A, B, C, D. Here are examples. Posting, did you know we have an Instagram channel on Slack? You can post a picture there.
Yeah, you see, I didn't know we had an Instagram channel in Slack. And I've been in there for 4 years. Which, and it comes to what comes up for me is this idea of the tensions that exist in this space, you know. And there's the if we had everyone in Enspiral was creating all of this content and all of these artifacts, it's like, oh yeah, I want to know about it all, but actually there's an overwhelm that comes with it. You know, to me, in this space, there's a real tension between fear of missing out and overwhelm. And you know, most of us are also in several other platforms and networks and work and different bits and pieces. And you know, what's the balance of that? And is the balance we have actually the right balance? But I suspect not. But you know, if you doubled the amount of, say, digital content and artifacts we were sharing and how we were doing it, would that become too much? You know, we know that, you know, a newsletter that comes out once a month, I'm going to look at and I'm going, oh, this is interesting. It's one of the ones I'll look at rather than harking. But if it came out every 3 days, I'd be going, oh, I don't have time for that. I'll get to that another time, and probably never look at any of them. And for me, what happens in the digital space is trying to resolve that tension between missing out, seeing everything, and overwhelm with too much volume. The answer tends to be more complication. And I give an example of this pharma group was in WhatsApp with 120 people, sometimes 20 to 40 active in a single WhatsApp group, a single stream. With overlapping, you could have 6 or 7 conversations overlapping all at once. It was really hard to engage with, but it was super simple, really low barrier to entry. And as soon as you try and then make that content more manageable, you're adding layers of complication. And what we're finding is we're adding barriers to engagement, and you're going to lose some people and lose it. And so I'm wondering what other tensions exist that you see. We've already talked to the other one of the aspiration and the ideal to share, but do I have time, energy, motivation to do so? And I'm curious about what else sits in this space that perhaps we're not naming when we talk about our aspirations. And wouldn't it be great if? But what's the tension that exists and that somehow we have to balance?
Yeah, I think what comes up for me immediately, and I have the same, like I work at a really large corporation, like 400,000 people worldwide. So this is like a really big corporation. And the question of information overflow is a huge challenge. But at the same time, getting the information to the people is also a challenge. And for me, one of the key insights is the self-responsibility is an important part. Like you cannot like assume that you can create a perfect system that's balanced for everyone. And you have to give some responsibility to the individual to decide how deep they want to go into, how much they want to consume, or they able to consume, and give them the control for that. I think that self-responsibility is key. And just as an example, the newsletter can be like the highest level of abstraction with summaries, and then there's a link that goes to, for example, to a Google document. And then there's much more information. And in the Google document, there's maybe a link to 3 Lumio discussions or something else. So people can choose to go deeper into the rabbit hole, but you offer it. But the most important thing is give that responsibility to the people. And you have to serve those with low attention span and those that are really interested, like in a way. So that's kind of the first thing that comes up for me.
Yeah, this makes a lot of sense for me, this kind of layers, and you just sense where you want to be, and this takes work, right? It takes organizing information, processing information, and serving it in a way that is mindful of the fact that people might choose to engage in different ways. And it actually feels to me like quite a role to take on, to actually process information, especially when we're not talking just about like one working group, but the kind of entirety of the organization, and just distill it in a way that anyone can find what is the right piece, right? Because that's really the challenge. Like, what is the piece that you as an individual need to hear, but I'm communicating to everyone. So it's really not easy. But also, yeah, I feel what you're sharing, Uli, about the self-responsibility, and just you need to put some effort and energy into finding the pieces. This also resonates. I mean, the kind of system, no matter how much energy we put in it, it will never be tailored for every single person and preference of engaging with information, especially since our preferences constantly change and we had better days and periods and worse as well. So there is something that definitely rings true, that, hey, if you feel that this space gives you value and it's something that you want to be a part of, and you feel like you would like to engage more, well, there is also your it is also your responsibility to take action. And maybe even if you don't know what's the next step or what's the piece that you should know, maybe you can just ask. and then to kind of switch the hat and put myself on the other side, maybe that's the most important responsibility, is to just really keep putting invitations, just small and big, for people to take the next step, whether it's, you know, something that feels very serious, create a new Lumio thread about something important, or maybe it's something very basic, just reply to a message, direct message, not even on Slack, but on WhatsApp, on Telegram, like through private channel that someone you met send you. Like, it's quite a low barrier of engagement, and it's a different layer. So yeah, this is what's coming up for me, creating invitations.
I think I'm going to slightly challenge that. I think there's validity to what you say about self-responsibility, but I think the tools we use get in the way of that. So what I try and like to do is sort of imagine what's the human version, the in-person version. And it's like, I imagine a huge, great hall with 1,000 people in it, you know, or even let's say 200 people in it. And there's lots of conversations happening in lots of groups. Now, I can engage in one of those and be fully present. And I might hear a snippet of conversation from one that's within earshot, go, hang on, that sounds interesting. I'm going to go and check that out. Or I might be over there, and then somebody who's in another conversation the other side of the room comes and taps me on the shoulder and says, hey, Nick, you need be part of this conversation. My experience of something like Slack is you've got a bunch of isolated rooms with a door on. And you can either choose to take the time to jump into everyone every single day, because, or basically you can jump into everyone where there's a voice being heard every single day. And I just don't have the energy to that. Or I have to say, those 17 rooms at the end of the corridor, I'm not going into. And so I don't have visibility. And I'm taking responsibility for the energy I have, but I'm actually not able to choose where that, you know, X box of energy I have can go, because I'm actually not even involved in it. So there's not like that sort of super high level, hey, here's a snippet of everything type channel I can be in, and then go, oh, that's of interest, let's dive into that conversation. And if I'm not careful, I dive into the conversation and make a comment in a thread. And then now I'm getting all notifications about all 27 other responses to that thread. And because the tool is blunt, I just get a red blob telling me there's something I've got to go and check out. And I've got to go in there, I've got to open it up, and I've got to check it out. You know, and it's like, so to me, it's very inhuman. And I've yet to find one that does it really well. And it's a search I think I'll be on for a while. But I'd love to meet people who are exploring that, because the way humans work in a big collection is you don't rely on hearing everything. You don't rely on someone giving you a summary of everything, but you do rely on your connection to the other people in the room, that you're kind of through so-and-so said so-and-so to so-and-so, and oh yeah, and I was talking to Joe the other day and he mentioned something, I thought it might be of interest to you, and then you can go and find it. So that's the interaction I feel is the more natural interaction that I'd love to see in a digital space. And I'd love to know, you know, from anybody who's had an experience close to that. What I see is a lot of walled gardens and silos, and it's down to the responsibility of the individual to go, I've got to traipse around every single one of these channels and check, because all I've got is a blob that says somebody's put something into the water cooler channel in Spiral Slack. I've got no idea whether that's of interest to me or not, but I got to go and check it, because it might be. And it's like, I just feel tired just talking about it, you know? So yeah, that self-responsibility is there, but I think the tools get in the way. I'd love for something to emerge that doesn't really.
Well, we kind of have that hierarchy, like water cooler is the place where everyone, and maybe you don't know that. I guess you know that this is the main channel for like everyone. That's why the name water cooler, like that's where you might meet if you were hanging out in one space, like in the kitchen. So that is kind of the place, and all the other channels are more dedicated to specific things. And I do think, for me at least, that's where the responsibility is of what's important to me. I join those channels. all the other channels I don't join. So I limit, because some people get overwhelmed if they see 25 channels and there's messages in all of these. Some people freak out, and they don't have to freak out because they can unsubscribe from all the stuff they're not interested in. And if someone really wants attention on a specific channel, they usually post it in water cooler. So that's kind of the idea, that if you don't follow anything, follow water cooler, and that's all, and then you jump into the other places. So this is kind of just one very specific stuff. But I do want to bring up, I think it's always a question of, I think, a combination of trade-offs in terms of what tools you use. And I also think it comes back to that 1% thing. There is people that like using these digital tools and they can do it all day. And there's folks that will never sign up with Slack, and they never open Slack. And maybe they opened it once, they forgot how to open it, and they will never come back. I'm sure there is a 2-digit percentage in terms of Enspiral member that never use Slack. It's maybe even 50% never use Slack. And I think that's also something I feel like maybe we should accept that's just the way it is. And we will, some people, we will, whatever we do, how much effort, the best tool, you will never get them there. And I do remember the discussion, and coming back to the trade-offs, some tools are better for something, and some tools have some advantages and disadvantages. And Slack, we have known Slack for many years, and there is the issue of after 3 months with the free plan, everything's gone. You work in a working group, you have a little break, a summer break, you come back, it's empty. All the work, all the conversations, all the links to all the documents, to all the Lumio conversations, everything is gone. And I think this is a price that's really high. And I remember last year, the discussion to move to a new tool and the resistance that came up. Oh my God, we cannot ask the Enspiral community to use a new tool, impossible. No, 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 no. And we're still stuck with a tool that like 20-30% would like to use, that limits the ability to work as a community, because someone says this 70% that's not using it, we can't get them through using another tool. They're not using at the moment anyway. So that argument for me is really annoying. And it's a question of trade-off. I don't think you get a perfect thing, and it's a question of trade-off. And I think if you handicap the small group of people that really want to active, to kind of leave the door open for the majority that will never walk through the door, I think you're doing something wrong. I'll just throw that on the table.
I know. I love that you were able to express that, and the real sense of the frustration. And I think that's where we hit with these tools, and that the compromise, the trade-offs. That's a really, really valid point. But I think also I want to throw in there is the bias that you kind of alluded to, is that if the conversation about what do we replace Slack with is happening in Slack, we've got a bias already, and it's like, how do we even break that? Because if we have it in Google Docs, we've got another bias, but it's still a bias. Or do we have it in email, Google Docs, Lumio, and on in-person Zooms and in Slack? And yeah, so I think we've got a way to go. I actually do think those tools will evolve. And what I'd love to see if I sort of waved a magic wand was, you can choose to engage using the Slack interface or the Twist interface or the Discord interface, but you're all pulling from the same database. So, like email, I can choose my email app that I use, but I can't choose the app that the organizations I work with communicate with. I have to jump between, I've got about 5 I have to monitor and track across, because of different clients. And it's like, no, actually, I want them all in one place. Now, I know there are tools that try and aggregate them, but it's still a Slack window and a something window and a something window. And it's like, what's the future version whereby we have this entity that is a message, and it's an open sourced version And I'd love to think somebody somewhere is working on that, probably linked to blockchain somehow or somewhere, you know, and we can then choose our window that maybe serves up the information in the way that we like it. And maybe that would help. Yeah, maybe that would help. Or maybe it would just be another whole layer of complication we don't need.
Michał, do you want to add anything to it? Because otherwise I would probably transition to another area of the discussion.
I think we can move along. I totally resonate with the frustration, and I had that with MailChimp. I can roll with Slack, but the newsletter, I'm so happy we migrated today. It was just giving me so much headache. So yeah, that was but it was much easier decision to make. It's a completely different barrier. So yeah. Should we touch upon what is Enspiral actually doing right since we've been around? Go for it.
I'd like to use the momentum of the tool to move into another space of the tool space, and then we can go on a higher level with the Enspiral question. Because the tool itself is like, you can use a knife for all kind of things, and it's just a tool, and the method or the practice of how you use the tool is another aspect. And I just want to emphasize that we can use tools in different ways, and the importance of being aligned on how we want to use it. Like, you should know water cooler is the main channel that you should subscribe, and everything else is optional. So someone has to tell you that's the case, because otherwise you see, I think there's more than 200 channels on Slack in total, like the ones you don't even see because you haven't subscribed. So I think that the question of tool is one thing, but like practice or like method is another aspect. And here I want to just focus on the, I think the fundamental paradigm or practice that we have in Enspiral is self-organization. Like, it's a self-organized network of volunteers. And this has a whole range of like implicit rules of what does that mean? Like, how do we work? How do we collaborate? There is no, or seldomly, like one person leading everything. Like, it's a question, and Alana has a really nice word for it. I think, is it called distributed leadership, or do you guys remember what's that called, Alana? No? Okay, anyway. So I think the whole aspect of working in a self-organized space or way is a whole discussion for me, but it's a really essential in terms of engagement, because this is kind of the rules of engagement that we have, and it's not very explicit, but it kind of make or breaks, like, oh, we're playing a game here, but we haven't told you the rules. Like, what is that? Like, and the self-organization has such mystical, magical, like vibes to it of, oh, it's a collective, the intelligence of the collective everything will work out by itself, it will just happen, it's magic. Like, and reality, nothing is happening, no one's doing anything, no one's taking the first step, and everyone's waiting for someone else to take the first step. And I find that so frustrating. And as I say, it's like we play a game, but we don't tell you the rules. And I remember like reading Reinventing Organizations from Frederic Laloux in 2017. That was the whole introduction. That's how I found Enspiral, by the way. And reading the book it's all about that self-organization, and it gives you the vibes of, this is amazing, this is like heaven, like this is just beautiful. And then I tried to apply it, and I failed so miserable. Like, I tried it at work, I tried it with like a volunteer group. I came into Enspiral as with the main motivation, I want to try self-management. And that was such a miserable, I had the worst and the best experience of collaborating in Enspiral. Like, I have had experience where I realized I like that person as a person, but I will never collaborate with that person in my life ever again. So that's an important realization. And I just find this, again, the whole layer of how we work, practice the method, I find that also like a really big, important aspect. Nick.
I think it's super important that you've named that, because where you have something in that order. It's very different from a hierarchical corporate structure. It's like, you will use this tool and you will be checking this. And if you haven't come to a meeting because you didn't see a notification in such and such a channel, that's your problem and you need to sort it out. As opposed to the invitation is, we're exploring this together, we're setting this up together. How are we going to do this? And like you say, often the rules aren't explicit, sometimes because they're evolving, but also sometimes because, I don't know, no one's been named as the person to tell the newcomers the rules, or it's written in a handbook that no one, perhaps people don't refer to as often as they could or should. So yeah, it's a whole nother layer, isn't it, in terms of the what structure you coming to this digital space with in the first place, and what are the implications of that? And that feels like a really important question to ask when starting to pick up some of the topics we've talked about today.
Michał, do you want to add anything to that?
I just laugh like with this insight of it's fascinating to hear that we have such a polarity of experiences. You mentioned before the 50% of people having great onboarding experiences, 50% having like really bad experience, and also like just finding people like, hey, you just can't collaborate with that person, and just there's this clash, like it's just not going anywhere. And that points out to me to also, it's the frustration, but it also the biggest strength somehow, because it points at the diversity of perspectives. And I love that in this network, that there's people that are coming from so many different ways of being. And sure, there is like a still similarity, right? But and probably we're more similar than different in many ways. But there is a lot more diversity that some of the other networks I'm a part of, and I see that as this challenging aspect of it sometimes can be a strength, because even if it's frustrating for me, at the end of the day, it can create a positive momentum, even if it's coming from a place of frustration. Like, I'm just so tired of this tool that I'm just going to do anything in my power that we, push forward to change that tool into something different. And that's a good thing. Maybe there's going to be resistance, and maybe, it's just not going to happen. Fair enough. It's still like a decentralized organism, and there is the whole decision-making side of things. But there is some energy that comes from conflict and tension, and it can be harvested into like this positive movement. And I was chatting with Mark yesterday, and he was bringing up this topic of things being living and non-living, and I feel like this is like very relevant in this context. Like this life force that can also coming through struggle, through challenge, through tension, is a very positive driving force, even if it's frustrating for an individual. And don't get me wrong, like I've been there and I've experienced also the painful side of it, and it's not fun at all. So I sympathize with the pain of tools and also bad collaborations. It can happen. Like, just some people are not a good match, and that's cool, because you learn from that. And it's really interesting that you still mention, hey, maybe you can still be friends on a personal level. You're just not the collaborator material, and that's also a great insight. Not everyone is good fit for your crew, right? It's maybe good to be a part of your congregation.
Yeah, and that also brings me to use the right tool and the right method and the right people for the right stuff. Like, you can again transition between, like, you can start off a new project with a message on Slack, people express interest, you go into a call, you record a call, you make some meeting minutes. So you can go in different spaces, but also, for example, some work is so much easier done in a small group than in a big group. And also sometimes it's easier to do it in a 1 time zone than in 3 time zones. And sometimes it's easier to have a quick chat on something really complicated where you could have endless back and forth discussions in writing, like on a messenger, where it's just too complicated to to work out in text messages, you have to have a conversation. But sometimes you also have to have like some illustration, like a mind map or something. So using the right tools for the right thing, knowing the limitations, also knowing like the purpose. And I really like, and this was also part of the workshop that I did with Enspiral, which I don't see happening much when I joined, that for different decisions, you have different decisions protocols, because if it's a small decision that has no impact, that could be changed with no effort, and it's only for a short-term goal, you don't have to get the consensus of 150 people. You can just decide yourself and do it. And some decisions are important, so you have to make an effort to get like at least consent from everyone. But there is different decisions protocols that are like suitable for specific purposes, and they have always advantages and disadvantages. Like you make a quick decision yourself, or in a small group, you exclude everyone else. But if you involve everyone, you slow it down, and it can take months to come to a decision, or you come to no decision, like which has happened in the last co-budget round. We had like at least 3 really important topics and discussions, and we could not come to a point of agreement, and no one was willing to take the responsibility to take it forward. It basically ran into a wall. So I think being aware of this, I sometimes feel like we're not really aware of it, and just naturally hit our head on some of these limits instead of just like going down a little and moving to the right and doing something else. What a shame.
I think that sort of alludes to, what does Enspiral do well, which is the question you posed, Michał, is that process you described earlier of, here's an idea, let's gather some initial thoughts, we'll transition to a call, we'll move to a Google Doc, we'll open a Lumia thread, It feels like elements of that are really good, and it's like, but when you hit a wall, there's perhaps not yet a clear way forwards. So that's definitely something I would say as, seeing that happen, even though my experience of it sometimes has been good personally, sometimes it's been bad personally, I can still see that, as you called it, that transition from one form to another. It retains engagement and engages different audiences at different points through something like a discussion or a decision-making process. And almost like the caveat to that is, what are the experiments that we need to run? I love that idea of just trying something that could be an explicit experiment. Say, next time we hit a block, or with one of these unblocked things, what could we try? What would be different? And I don't see that happening. And again, it may be happening offline and out of sight. It's almost like the ones that don't get blocked and go through, that may have happened along the way, but I didn't notice because it was seamless. So I think there's some neat stuff that does happen in that digital space that achieves a level of engagement that perhaps wouldn't be achieved otherwise.
I think from my point of view, the most activating side of things on like this digital engagement side of things is just the openness and encouraging vibe of people. So, I mean, I experienced that in a way that when I came to Enspiral, I was quite intense about reading, all Lumio things and handbooks. And, I just wanted to get all the context information. And I've been quite active from the very beginning. I joined a working group, all that kind of things. And it was just such a kind space. So even if there was sometimes, I mentioned that like this anxiety of posting something, it's always just received nicely, even if sometimes there is no reaction, right? It can happen that you're just posting and it feels like nobody's responding. But I kind of, I don't know, this was maybe never really made explicit, but somehow I never had this expectation that people would just like be commenting on my posts. But there is this feeling of kindness and support and it's not something, you know, you can really measure, but just how people show up is just so nice that it makes it feel very welcoming space. And I feel it makes a very big difference. Just it makes it so much easier to post something and interact with someone. And so far, you know, every person I interacted with, if there was, you know, a one-on-one, it was great. You know, maybe it didn't lead to lifelong friendship, but that's also not the point. You know, it's just weaving the network, getting to know each other, being exposed to different ideas, and just connecting. And so I feel for me this is maybe the most critical, intangible side of things that seems to be working very well. And I would even risk a hypothesis that maybe this kindness and encouraging vibe is what makes Enspiral really like long lasting. I mean, I don't know how it was a couple of years ago, but my assumption is this kind vibe probably was there in one way or another. And it seems to me like it's a legacy. It's not something new that just happened in, you know, the recent iterations. Yeah, and it just feels easy while it still is somewhat professional environment. So it's, you know, it's not the same experience as I would have in some, you know, Discord with just like having a blast and fun and jokes. So there is like a level of professional, career, business. There's still some play, but you know, the main focus is in a different area of life. But still, there's softness there. It's like, huh, nice. I feel welcome. Yeah, I think this is how I can summarize it into one short sentence. I feel welcome to just engage and post and comment and write whatever, and it's going to be received, and that's it.
Yeah, just to give that a different perspective, my first collaboration in Spiral within the first 2 months was the worst experience of my life. So I will not go into any specifics. I will not name any names, but it was the worst. Just to give you a different perspective, not everyone had that smooth, positive, easy going. I'm not sure. Nick, do you want to comment on that, your experience in any way?
I think it is that dichotomy, you know, between the good and the bad, the ups and the downs, and it's so individual. So, you know, I had an experience going through a digital engagement process with Enspiral where I didn't want to ever engage again in a process like that. Full stop, end of story. And yet, you know, before then, I'd had some amazing connections and that welcomingness, that openness, and so forth. And I think sometimes that's what makes it feel jarring, because it can swing from one side to the other. And I look back now and see, again, I think I didn't know what the rules were. And these were not explicit named rules. These were kind of like underground rules that no one really knew about, but actually were there. And so I went in with lots of energy and engaging fully and jumping onto calls and in documents and threads and bits and pieces. And then all of a sudden, kind of getting towards the end, and it felt like the rules had changed. And it's like, oh, okay. And it was like the biggest slap in the face. And it's kind of like, oh, and even if I'd asked what the rules were at the start, I would have been told a different picture to what was revealed at the end. So I think sometimes even if the rules were stated, the experience can actually be different. Yeah. You know, and I've grown to love some of the real unboundaried, sort of not quite clear aspects of Enspiral. And I can't really sort of put a finger on it, except perhaps that I'm getting more comfortable in chaos. having come from a very sort of structured background, and that's part of my personal journey. So would I have a different experience now? I think I would, but I also think I would meter my engagement to a level that I was investing with an idea that there was going to be an outcome of a form that I would recognize as being a valid outcome. And when the outcome was kind of hitting a brick wall, it was just like a real shock. So yeah, I can relate to what both of you are saying, and also what you said earlier, Michał, is that within that tension can be real opportunity for evolution and seeing differently, and that wasn't captured in that moment, and it could have been handled very differently. But again, it's like we're a self-organizing network. Whose responsibility is it to come along and sit me down and say, "Hey Nick, what's going on?" And what was my responsibility was to actually sit myself down, consider what my experience was, and then express that in a way that wasn't riddled with frustration and everything at the time. So it has such an impact on engagement, both sides of that. But I'm not sure there's any easy answer, apart from more talking, more openness, more trust, more creating spaces where it's okay to point to somebody and say, the way you were, what you did really triggered me, and I feel it's affecting this process as a result and my engagement in it. Let's have a conversation. I think I'm more in a space where I could have that conversation now, but again, it comes down to motivation and energy to do so. So yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting.
Yeah, I just want to add, and then maybe I'll leave it there. During those moments, there were many times where I thought I'll forget all of this. I'm out. Like I really had enough. And you hit really low points, and that's also part of some of the conversations you two had in your previous recording. I don't know if it really has to be like this hard. It can be made a little softer, I think. I do think that there can be ways of improving it. How to do it in a self-organized way without having clear responsibilities is a different question, how to do it. But I don't like the excuse of like, yeah, sink or swim. It's all on you. It's your problem. Like, I don't like it. I don't like it. I don't think that's right. I don't like it. But I'm happy to also transition to the main question we had of what's Enspiral doing well, because obviously Enspiral is doing things well, unless anyone else wants to add more to that specific thing. Nick, Michał. Yep. And the first thing that comes up for me, and this is kind of quite general, but I think the gatherings is something, and that's probably not new and only with Enspiral. Other networks do this as well. Having these in-person events is the most effective way of letting things happen and forming connection, trust. So I think having these gatherings, I think, is kind of probably a key success factor, I think. And what comes up for you both in terms of like what's Enspiral doing really well?
I mean, following on from that, I'm really quite excited about what might happen with the new new structure of nodes that would allow more gatherings to reach more people in different regions. And I think that can be, it comes back to that idea of I was talking before of, grounding in place and actually splitting out almost regionally, locally, where you can connect in person, and then the digital connection becomes supported by that. So that's definitely something I see as being a really interesting evolution. And some of the things that have been tried, like pods, for example, which groups of 4, 5, 6 people for a few weeks, potentially 2 or 3 months on a topic. Yeah, I had some very good connections and experiences within that pod framework. So yeah, those things are working. I think what's yet to happen is for it to become a cohesive system. If you talk about living systems, and I've used this example recently a few times, is if you think you've got a community, and in that you've got the family, and within that you've got the human, and within that you've got the organs, and within that you've got the cells. It's nested within nested within nested. It sometimes feels like we've got a community, a couple of arms, a big toe, and 2 livers. And then we're just performing CPR on it constantly to keep this thing alive. So my wondering is what makes the network it's living itself. I think gatherings are a hugely big part of that. Referencing the micro-solidarity work, we've got dyads and crews and congregations and different elements. So experimentation in that space, I think Enspiral has come through a lot of iterations. But sometimes, and I wonder what's, nodes is a big one. And it's like, well, what comes alongside that? What's the other things that people are trying? And there could well be things people are doing that I'm not aware of. And I think that being a space for people to come to and experiment is something as a canvas that Enspiral does really well, and is very open to.
Yeah, what I can add on top, because for me also gatherings kind of, it's the kind of critical beat, but more looking at specifically digital side of things. I really like our newsletter, and like now I'm speaking maybe from the biased point because I'm writing it, but I loved it from the beginning. Like, just such a simple idea, just signposting, this is happening, this person posted this is a conversation that is happening. Just this first layer of showing you what is happening. And then there's the whole conversation, how it could be more alive, how it could be more interesting, all that side, but that's kind of secondary for me. But just the rhythm and the function of directing people, if they choose to the right place. And yeah, I loved when also Jorian before used to make the videos and he was the catalyst, and that was always like a great fun for me to watch. Like, I would actually book time. I would make time to really engage with the newsletter. And I was like, oh wow, it's the only newsletter that I'm doing that. So that was interesting. I mentioned the kindness of people and this gentle encouragement, and I also sympathize with that, and I understand that it might be just from my perspective, and I know that people bring different perspectives, and that's also an interesting comment that I would like to make on what you shared before, that this is also like this invisible things in the network that from my point of view it might be like this perfect thing because I just happen by luck or whatever other factor to have great collaborators and good experiences in onboarding and all sorts of different steps, but another person could have actually quite bad experiences, and I would just not understand why this person is so critical. What do you mean? It's great. It's working. But yeah, what really makes a difference for me is just this kindness of people. I feel that, even in comments when there's conflicts of opinions, even how they're communicated, or at least from what I've seen so far, is always very gentle, very kind. And it feels to me like it's a feeling that I'm getting that this network in digital spaces specifically creates, that the doors are always open for me to participate if I choose to. And that's kind of, for me, that's enough. And maybe that's also enough because my personality is, I'm curious, I want to engage, I'm following the digital channels. So I just need sometimes this vibe, like, oh yeah, the doors are open. And it still took me some time. I'm in Enspiral, what, 2 years now? Something like this. And it still took me time to be able to independently make some decisions. But as I go through that process, I just find encouragement. You know, I can ask someone and then people are, yeah, they give me the suggestions that are helpful, like genuinely helpful from a place of gifting and compassion and support. And yeah, it's just the feeling. It's not a specific tactic I can point on. It's just, yeah, the whole feeling of the network. And of course, it's my experience. But it makes me feel welcome. It makes me invested in it for the long game.
By the way, you were breaking up a few times, twice, Michał. Internet, I'm not sure. Well, hope we're not. So I'd like to comment a few points on this and add to it. I definitely think that over the last 10 years or plus that Enspiral has as a community, I think some of the, I like to call them the elder that's been here for a while, there is a lot of experience and skill of like how to deal with humans, and that can show through, and you can be in really good hands if you stick around long enough and you have had experiences, a couple of experience, and you have made connections with a couple of people. So I definitely would see that as a strength, although and that's due to the self-organized nature and like also the rotation of people leaving or people going in high orbit and disengaging, new people coming in. There's no guarantee. It's still like throwing dices of like whether you will have a good experience in this regard or not. So it's a bit of a random thing. So that's a bit of a thing. In terms of experimentation, as Nick said, my sense since I joined, I feel like there was little experimentation that I have observed, and I really missed it. I did deliberately choose to come to Enspiral as a big playground for self-organization, and some of the activities that I engaged with, they were quite set. And when you're in the middle of it, everyone's quite set of, oh, I only have 1 hour today. We have to get to the point of this agenda point, and we have to finish. Oh, time's over. Like you're still in the thing, and that whole awareness of, hey, we should experiment, like have that meta level of not just do what you do, but also look at how you do it and whether you can do it differently or better. And like deliberately making an investment of, hey, let's try something else and experiment and then evaluate and make some conclusions. I've not seen it much. Like the nodes is definitely the biggest that's happened. Other than that, haven't seen it that much. So I'm just pointing out, I wish for a little more experimentation. And also, and that's kind of for me, I have 2 points. There is what also drew me to Enspiral is the public work, that some individual that were very visible in the public, like Rich, Alana, and they did so much work and shared it with videos, blog posts, and I think that contributed hugely to the reputation that Enspiral has built over the last 10 years. So I'll put that on the huge plus side. But also I feel like I haven't seen any of that in the 3 years I've been here. I think I've seen 2 blog posts that have been created in 3 years. And that feels a little less, although micro solidarity is kind of springing off from Enspiral, but it has become its own thing. So we have to like see maybe the ecospace or better work together, or like the workshop that's happened last year in, I think, December. That's kind of all stuff that came out of it and maybe has now its own thing. But in terms of like at the very core of Enspiral, I kind of miss that sharing, and that the podcast we're doing right now, and that has a very strong drive through Michał, because if Michał hasn't scheduled these conversations and has made these recordings, they would not have happened. So I'd like to see more of experimentation and then also sharing, because that sharing is not just with the world, but also with Enspiral, with like, it's another layer of that, like sharing best practices and like transferring that knowledge in the collective. So I really, really like that. And the last point I want to mention, I think in 2019 or 18, there was a restructure for the subscription model, like the financial side of Enspiral. And before that, I'm not sure if that's in some of the other conversations, maybe with JV, I'm not sure. It was actually financially really difficult, but since we've changed to that model, that has really gave Enspiral a strong foundation financially, which is also a really important aspect. And I'm quite curious to see with the new node model, how do we translate the financial model into that new structure and make it sustainable? So this is something we haven't worked out yet. And so there's something coming, but I just want to like value and appreciate that the financial structure has been really stable, and there was a lot of effort that was put into making that as it has been for the last few years. Yep.
I feel like we're naturally arriving towards the end of the conversation. It's been, wow, what a journey. I feel like we covered a lot. And I'm really happy that also we mentioned and named quite a lot of the shadow side of things. And, you know, this is very important, I feel, and I love this transparency and honesty and yeah, sharing not just the goods and the things that we're proud of, but also the challenges, because yeah, they are at the end of the day just opportunities to iterate, and eventually someone will get frustrated enough to make a change. Hopefully. That's how I like to at least approach this kind of tensions. So yeah, I feel like we can move towards the closing part. I always like to close with some kind of more advisey, suggesty summary. So I wonder, you know, from harvesting from all these learnings from our conversation today and what we observe in Enspiral and also in your other networks that you're involved with, like what are the kind of simple principles to think about, or tactics, when, you know, you're thinking about engagement in your organization, what to pay attention to, like what are the simplest things that actually bring the biggest results?
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that sort of stands out for me, and it's really come through, I think, in this conversation as well, is honoring the individuality, and just really thinking it's sort of like guidelines and a light scaffolding helps, but create too much of that and it becomes rules, and that's not going to suit everyone. So, you know, if I was talking to someone who was exploring this side of things for themselves, I'd say just don't think that everyone's like you, don't put everyone in the box, you know, and just what's the lightest boundaries and guidelines you can put in place that would actually help and support, but not get in the way. And then let me know how you did it, because I'll be really interested.
Yeah, I think I can only like some stuff we touched on, and in summary, I think some of the unspoken rules, and I'm now maybe speaking specifically to newcomers or as a reminder for people that have disengaged for a while. Yeah, you don't really have to ask for permission or consensus to start something. So I think this is kind of one of the rules. And don't wait for someone else to like give you permission or something. Like this is kind of a really hard thing to kind of understand when you come from traditional structures and ways of working. Also for me, I think a key point is the self-responsibility, because no one really is responsible to look after you, and it's down to yourself to look after yourself. And this means also looking out that you don't overwork yourself, but that also you ask for support, and also you do what engages you or like that motivates you. If you don't do that, or you, and which the mistake I did, I kind of waited for the right thing to come up so that I could engage, and it never came up until I created or like utilized opportunities myself. So, and I would add to give it time, like Nick said in your previous conversation and what's in his guide, that it does really need time, and you have to go through some lows and highs and different experiences before you can really judge it. If you end at a first frustration, which is very tempting, and I've been there many times, you're missing out on some really good opportunities that wait after that low that hopefully comes. If it doesn't come, it's the right thing to leave. But usually, as it is with many things, it's an up and down. So, yep, that's what comes up for me.
Thank you for sharing. I feel for me what's coming up from this conversation, one is just this idea of the picture artifact. Like it just somehow stayed in my mind as just such a simple way of showing everyone that something is happening, and just like, hey, wow, look, people are connecting, things are happening. So this is one thing that kind of just resonated with me. And the other one, yeah, is something around this deliberate putting yourself in other people's shoes, and like if you're super engaged, how does it feel not to engage, and why, and just kind of try to process that, bringing again this idea of diversity. Yeah, and the last part is really what I was kind of iterating on before, is the kindness part, just be nice, encouraging, and welcoming, and keep opening the doors for people to make them feel welcome to participate. And if they choose not to, it's also fine.
Yeah, let me just add, like taking that picture and taking the picture and posting it somewhere, it's almost zero effort. Just to point this out, like it's not much effort, and it can have so much impact. And in the same vibe, just adding a little emoji to a message on Slack or Lumio gives the author such a different feel. Like if you post, you put like a huge effort into something and there's zero response. It's such a different, and it's for you, you read it because you can see how many people read it, and just click that little button. You that's so little effort for you, but it can help so much for someone else. I just want to add that before we close.
Thank you for sharing. That's, yeah, makes a big difference. click the emoji. Thank you so much for this conversation. It was really, really beautiful to yarn together and get some insights on the engagement side of things. Big pleasure to connect with you.
Thank you both.
Same. Thank you.